Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behavior as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk Podcast, the series where I speak to people who can help us to understand the risks of human decision-making and what we can do to mitigate them. On this episode, I'm exploring the topic of ethics. It's something I've looked at before, and my guest this time helps me to explore it through an angle I've not covered before on the podcast: religion. When we think of the codes of conduct enshrined in most religions, they all have an ethical component. Many have lists of things people should do and things they shouldn't. So the challenge of codifying desirable and undesirable behaviors and getting people to comply with the spirit as well as the letter of the law are things that religions have been dealing with long before the word compliance was invented, let alone the function that bears its name. My guest on this episode is Rabbi Yonason Goldson, who specializes in looking at ethics. Yonasan blends a fascinating personal story and his knowledge of scripture to provide some interesting insights into how we can think about ethical dilemmas in the 21st century. Although we think we're living in unprecedented times, many of the human challenges we face are similar to those our ancestors faced, which makes what Yonasan has to say really interesting. Whether you're religious or not, and if you are, whatever form your faith takes, this is a lively conversation that I think you're going to enjoy. Yonasan, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you, Christian. I'm glad to be with you.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. And look, what I like to do to start with is to get people to introduce themselves, because you'll do a much better job of talking to me about yourself than I will.
You know, after doing a few of these podcasts, I find I get so tired of my own story. I'm afraid that I'm going to bore the listeners, but I'm realizing that they haven't all heard it. I like to start off back where I went to college, the University of California, and studied English, which of course is very useful if you want to do what I was going to do, which was hitchhike across the United States for half a year, across the Atlantic, backpacked across Europe for about half a year, ended up in Israel, and that's where I connected with my Jewish roots, which I'd really known nothing before that. Ended up living in Israel for 9 years, met my wife, had our first 2 children, became an Orthodox rabbi, and then embarked on my career as a high school teacher and wanting to impart the lessons and the wisdom and the discipline that I had learned to high school students. Taught for 23 years, 1 year in Budapest, Hungary, 2 years in Atlanta, Georgia, and 20 years in St. Louis, Missouri, where I live now. 4 years ago in 2016, my school closed, victim of politics. We were too far to the middle, as I like to say. So I had to decide what I want to do when I grew up. And that's when I started my business as a professional speaker. I tried to take the wealth of wisdom that I'd accumulated from the study of 3,000 years of Jewish tradition and distill it down into a soundbite. And I came up with ethical leadership and intellectual diversity. And so I've been teaching professionals, leaders, how good ethics is good business. And of course, the business has changed a little bit in the last few months. So like many of us, I'm trying to figure out how to cope with a more virtual world. But that's part of what I'm doing here. And glad to be having the conversation with you.
Excellent. Well, look, I'm glad it's brought you here. And it's sort of this sort of conversation feels perfectly normal, whereas I think even a year ago there was a novelty value attached. So I'm delighted that if nothing else, COVID has kind of brought some of us more closely together. And I'm fascinated by this connection between ethics and business because, there's a lot of talk about it now. And, I'd love to come on and sort of explore the rationale behind that. But it does seem as if this is a little bit of a revelation to some people that when you say, to run a successful business, you need to be ethical. That doesn't seem to be immediately obvious if you look at many of the business plans and strategies that are out there. And I wondered if you had a sense as to why that might be.
Man, that really is a question that recurs again and again. I was speaking to another podcaster and in the course of discussing this, she said to me in sort of an exasperation, why? This is so obvious. Why doesn't everybody get it? The soundbite I like to go to is we don't have to choose between being good and being successful, because ethics, it builds trust. Trust inspires passion. Passion generates productivity and loyalty. And when you're in an environment, when you have relationships where you trust those people you're working with, where you share a common vision and a common sense of mission, then everybody is going to be working collaboratively. And everything is going to move forward in a natural way. But when you start undermining those relationships of trust, I mean, relationships are the bedrock of everything in our lives: family, society, business. You don't trust the people you're working with, you're not going to work effectively. You're not going to be committed. If you don't trust the people with whom you're doing business, you're always going to be watching your back. And if you are so focused on short-term gains that you're willing to sacrifice long-term values, then ultimately you're going to undermine your own cause. And those short-term limited payoffs are not going to last, and you're going to pay for them in the end.
And it's interesting, if you go back in time, traditionally in sort of, closed communities or smaller communities, everybody knew who everybody was. And the point that you make is entirely right, which is that you couldn't afford to behave in a bad manner because you'd be found out and word would spread and people wouldn't do business with you. And then we sort of evolved as a society, and there were more opportunities, I guess, to do that, where lots more businesses have the opportunity over time, particularly now with the internet as well, to sort of engage in short-term exercises where they're not interested in building that long-term relationship. And so I found it fascinating that we've almost come full circle, where if I go back a few hundred years, the things you were talking about would have been there. We've then gone through a period, what I very unfairly probably call the souks of Morocco issue, which is sort of, if I go into the souks of Morocco, the likelihood of me ever buying anything from them again, purely logistically, I'm never going to find the place again, means that there is a greater propensity for people in that sort of situation to rip me off, because there's no reason to build a long-term relationship with me. I'm not going to find Souk 57 and the individual. But generally speaking, if I'm involved in something where there's a repeat business, you would think that sense of loyalty is there. But there are a lot of businesses that don't operate on that basis. And yet we're now coming full circle along the lines that you've been suggesting.
Yeah, it is. I want to pick up on one point you made there about the change in the way the world works. There's a wonderful TED Talk by Susan Cain. It's one of the most watched TED Talks of all time. And she talks about how when people lived in small villages, it wasn't uncommon that you might meet 50, 100 people in the course of your life. And so, as you said, everybody knew everybody. And people had the opportunity to really get to evaluate the character of the people with whom they came in contact. And so people who were more introverted are often people who are more thoughtful, are more reflective, and people valued those qualities. But after the Industrial Revolution, when there was a big influx to the cities, and now you're meeting people so rapidly and so many of them, you don't have time to really get to know people. So the visceral response is an attraction to gregariousness, to charisma. And apparently there's a zero correlation between those qualities and authentic leadership qualities. But those are, look at our, or don't look at our political race going on.
I'm in the UK, we can't talk, so don't worry.
Yeah, I know, but it just seems every 4 years it gets worse. And what's so astonishing is, after the last presidential debate, the whole country was reacting the same way. What happened, and how did we get here? Nobody likes what's going on, and yet we can't seem to do anything about it, and it just keeps getting worse. The culture feeds into that immediate gratification. So in this case, the gratification is gladiatorial spectacle. Two people simply beating up on each other, and the fascination with what's going on without a sense of real character, real quality, real exchange of meaningful ideas. But when you say, if we bring that back down to our individual lives, our intimate relationships, our business relationships, the hope is that the pendulum's swinging back, and that the people who are recognizing the value of personal integrity are going to start coalescing into groups that will create a more character-driven culture.
And do you see what's happened? I mean, particularly given your knowledge of history and scripture, is there a sense that we're this is cyclical, or is what we've been through quite unique in the sense of where we've ended up?
That's a really interesting question. I do come at everything with a biblical perspective and a historical perspective. And, the history of the Bible, in particular, the history of the Jewish people, is one of success and failure, and success and failure, and success and failure. And the underlying dynamic is that when we recognize our sense of national mission and we coalesce, we become strong. And what usually drives that is a common enemy. Of course, we believe this is all divinely directed, but even if you just look at it in terms of human dynamics, you have a common enemy, you pull together, all of those little trivial and petty differences become irrelevant because it's a matter of survival. Right? Now we coalesce, we become strong, we defeat the enemy, and then we become victims of our own success. Because now that there's no common enemy, now we start finding ways of fighting with each other, becoming focused on, again, short-term goals instead of long-term vision. Society begins to break down, and we become vulnerable to the next enemy. And then the process repeats itself. The Friedrich Hegel said that the great lesson of history is that no one listens from it. No one learns from it. It's time we started getting the message. And how do we do that? I mean, it's conversations like these that we try to raise the level of discussion, get people to really think about not what's right now, not what's tomorrow, but what's down the road and how that's going to serve me best.
But I mean, that's quite challenging in a world where we're all facing, it's a very interesting time where we're all facing this danger. And there are different perceptions as to the risk it poses, and clearly it does pose different risks to different people. But COVID, sort of makes us aware of our mortality in some respects, particularly the older one get. And you've also then got a sort of proliferation of information, and society seems to be speeding up. So there are lots of trends out there that sort of point to at least a benefit in some form of short-term thinking, because we're having, we're required to think more quickly, respond more quickly, everything's moving more quickly. And then we've got this backdrop of COVID and other challenges. Climate change would be another piece that all would point towards short-term decision-making is if you ignore the sort of ethical components, what makes sense in the moment, it's a lot more logical to think short-term now than it might have been before. Do you think that sort of is impacting us?
Well, sure, but there always has to be a balance. I mean, we have a short-term brain. If you're in crisis mode, you have to respond to the crisis. Right? You can't be making your. I'm talking to my son, who he was living in Israel. He was in the tourist industry. Well, that completely shut down. So he went from having a very solid job on a career track to sitting in his apartment, waiting for things to change. And when they started to open up a little bit, so he got a job as a waiter in a restaurant. And then a few weeks later, everything shut down again. So he moved to New York, where he was able to find a job in the healthcare industry. And it's not particularly the career track he wants to be on. But he said to me he's very frustrated because, he feels that he should be planning his life. And I said to him, pretty much what you just said. This is not the time to be making long-term plans. Right? This is the time you can be planning to make long-term plans. But you have to deal with the facts on the ground. At the same time, if you're not thinking long-term, then you're going to be reactive more than responsive. And that's not a good plan over time. When things are very intense and very in the moment, you have to respond to the moment. But we have to be able to be flexible, to shift back and forth between these two ways of looking. I mean, the human condition is one of somewhat schizophrenia. We're all split personalities. We're individuals living in a communal world. We're spiritual beings in physical bodies. We have immediate needs, and we have to make long-term plans. And those are fluid. There's a tension there. And trying to eliminate that tension is a big mistake. Recognizing the tension and balancing and moderating it, mediating it, that's the way that we achieve long-term success.
And if we look at ethics as a sort of driving force, I mean, you described very clearly where that sits in your, in your thoughts and in the priorities that you have. How do you sort of think about what ethics is and what the right thing to do is?
Yeah, well, that's a long, complicated discussion. But
feel free to take as long as you need, as long as it's less than half an hour.
I have a book that's just coming out right now called "Grappling with the Gray," which is talking about the gray areas and about the gray matter. Right? Because one of the common mistakes and one of the refrains that you hear that I think is so damaging and so misguided is, well, it's not illegal. And this is the problem with compliance. I often say that compliance can be the enemy of ethics. And we need compliance. We need compliance laws, but we need to understand that that's the foundation. That's the beginning. That's the starting point. Right? Because once you relegate ethical decision making to a code, you basically relinquish your responsibility to make ethical decisions. You can't legislate ethics. Ethics falls in those gray areas between what's legal and what's illegal. And we have to cultivate a mindset of wanting to do what's right. Of course, the next step in this discussion is, well, who decides what's right? And how do we decide what's right? Because often the decisions are between right and right, or wrong and wrong, or prioritizing. And so, in classical philosophy, there are 4 different models of how to make good decisions and how to define morality. And they're all flawed. No one of them really works. But if you blend them together, then you can start to have an approach. But the real starting point is the desire to do the right thing. I have to want to do what's right before I can start talking about actually doing what's right or knowing what's right.
It's interesting when you talk that, because I was sort of reflecting on, we have this desire to codify things. Because human beings, we can start with something like the 10 Commandments as a really, really good example of a codification, a sort of attempt to give. So we naturally tend towards that. And so when we think about compliance versus ethics, part of the reason people do what you were suggesting is quite rightly is outsourcing difficult decision making to someone else. So if I can I'm following the rules, therefore I must be okay, without having to think too hard about whether those are sensible rules to be followed. But there is a certain logic in it, in that we do thrive better when we have a little bit of guidance in our lives. So I have got sympathy to a certain extent for people that do make that approach to ethics, sitting at the compliance end of the spectrum, because actually, if we don't have any forms of guidance, then life gets a little bit difficult for us. And we can all legitimately, and there are cultural reasons and there are situational reasons why we might draw different conclusions to exactly the same problem for very legitimate, sensible reasons. And so this codification, to a certain extent, has a place.
Absolutely. And that's why I said you have to start with that code of compliance. So you have to start with the law. But an interesting historical observation, the Second Temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70. And the sages discussed the spiritual, the metaphysical reasons why the temple was destroyed. And they looked at Jewish society at the time, and they said that one of the key elements that undermined Jewish society was that the Jewish people were following the letter of the law. Now, that doesn't sound like such a terrible thing, does it? But what they're telling us is that they were manipulating the law They were using loopholes to subvert the intent of the law, to eliminate the spirit of the law. And that's a corruption. Right? If you can, you can find a loophole to justify just about anything if you're creative enough. And rather than using that creative impulse to defend and excuse what I want to do, what I should be doing is using my creativity and my moral sincerity to try to identify what should I be doing. If I go into a shop and I get out to my car and I realize that they undercharged me, do I have a legal obligation to go back in and tell them about their error? I'm not sure, frankly. I don't know what the law says about that. But I certainly have a moral obligation. Now, nobody's going to know. They're probably never going to discover their error. I don't have to tell anybody. There's no chance of getting caught. So why should I go in and pay money that I don't have to pay? Because that is how I retain my commitment to justice, to the spirit of the law, to the integrity of society, and to my responsibility to look out for the rights of others rather than simply standing on my own rights.
The counter argument that I know you will have a put up for, but I think is worth exploring nonetheless, is to say, well, okay, well, that's fine. You can go and do all those things. But actually, if other people don't play along with that, then you're putting yourself at a significant strategic advantage. So that the honest person in a town of liars is going to struggle to see their way of the world changed because there's this prevailing force of nobody else is playing by the same rules. And that plays with a sort of sense of fundamental fairness. But also from an effectiveness perspective, you could say, well, that's just foolish to do that because you're in a world where nobody else is, or limited other numbers of people are playing by the rules. What would you say to that sort of piece that says it's a nice idea, but it's tactically naive?
Well, we have these ideas built into our language. Nice guys finish last, and no good deed goes unpunished, and those sorts of cynical aphorisms. Certainly, you have to protect yourself. The trust but verify. Don't leave yourself vulnerable to unscrupulous people. If you're living in a town where everybody's a thief and liar, really the only solution is move.
Right.
A number of years back, I think it's 20 years now, but the big scandal was Enron, this major corporation that frankly most Americans have never even heard of, and it simply disintegrated. And in the postmortem, it was discussed that the culture of the corporation was one where the top management pitted the lower executives against each other. They thought they were going to create this culture of drive and ambition and relentless pursuit of success. And what they really did is they created a culture that was toxic and that was corrosive. And it worked for a long time until eventually the whole thing collapsed. So, yeah, ethics doesn't mean being naive. It doesn't mean having a Pollyanna, a Pollyanna view of the world. It means that if I set higher standards for myself, then there is a chance that people around me will notice. And if you see people behaving well, there is something inside you that admires that and that thinks, maybe I should hold myself to that standard as well. And it all comes down to cultural inertia. When you look at the problems that we have in contemporary society, so much of it is driven by the media. The media thrives on scandal, and spectacle. And, if it bleeds, it leads. And the algorithms are all programmed. And if you go on YouTube, everything you watch, the next suggestion is going to push you a little bit more to the extremes. And if we allow those algorithms and that cultural inertia power over us, then we will become more corrupt if we resist it. And if we associate with people, Jim Rohn, the great business guru, he says, you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And I love that, because you can find 5 people you can admire. I think we all know 5 people we admire. And spending time doesn't just mean physically. Spending time can mean the videos we watch, the shows we watch, the podcasts we listen to, the news we consume. Rather than choosing the outlets that prey on our baser instincts, we discipline ourselves to expose ourselves to outlets and to people and to voices that uplift as well as inform. Then we help contribute to a culture that is moving in the right direction instead of moving in the wrong direction.
And it is fascinating when you think about where we get our information from. And I don't just mean the media or social media, but just the sources of data that we have available and the way things work. I mean, we're not equipped to handle that stuff. And one of the things I think is interesting, if I take that mythical town that I was talking about where everybody except you is dishonest, is you would have fairly accurate data in the traditional world to be able to make that assessment because you'd engage with people. Nowadays, there's a strange piece where on the one hand, we've got a heck of a lot more data about what people are doing, how they're doing, not just what companies are doing, but how they're doing it. On the other hand, there's also a heck of a lot more misinformation. So to a certain extent, it's really interesting because I think the ability to make assessments about people's ethical standpoints has in many respects never been greater because we can start to wheedle things out. So companies can say one thing, but if they behave in a different manner, we'll find out because employees have a voice that they didn't have before. So that's there. And I think that's very, very powerful and a good source. But on the other hand, as you point out, people doing the right thing, following the COVID regulations, saying nice things, helping their neighbors out, it's not particularly newsworthy. So there's a misinformation piece that's sort of, or disinformation even in many cases, that's kind of clouding the thing. So I find it fascinating that we are sort of shifting in a way where the world that you implicitly suggest would be a nice one for us to, the things that we ought to be trying to do, we've got the tools. And yet there's this prevalent force that's sort of pushing us in the opposite direction of assuming actually that everybody's up to no good because all we see is bad people doing bad things.
Yeah, well, think of it in terms of, we've all had to learn some kind of skill in our lives, whether it's a musical instrument or sports or education, a degree, a trade. Think about the discipline that goes into doing that. If you want to be a really good musician, if you want to be a top athlete, if you want to be successful in your business or your trade, that takes work and that requires discipline. Well, why should it be different in our personal lives? Anybody who's married or been married will tell you it's hard. You get married thinking it's going to be this wonderful, romantic, all the things that you read about or you saw in the movies, and it's tough. I've been married for 32 years.
Congratulations.
And, I'll accept that. I think my wife should accept it more than I do, but we're both well-meaning people. We both have the same values in life. We both wanted the same things in our home and our family. It's incredibly difficult to build a home, to live with the same person all the time and try to accept their shortcomings and their own human failings, while at the same time trying to create an atmosphere where you're both improving. If it's all about me, it's not going to last very long.
Right.
And it doesn't. The success of marriage these days is sad. And part of it has to do with this culture of, I want mine. I want to be happy. I want to be fulfilled. I want someone to take care of me. Well, if we would focus on our responsibilities before we focus on our rights, then instead of bumping into each other all the time, we'd be looking out for each other more often. So we all can understand this on a basic intellectual level. The problem, as you say, is that when the culture is such that you don't seem to be able to get ahead, which, again, I don't believe is true, but I believe there's a perception of that. The people who are, the dog-eat-dog people, they're the ones who seem to be getting all the attention. Right? Is that real success? What about all the examples that we don't hear about of the people who are really committed to ethics? I mean, look at somebody like Simon Sinek, who is such an articulate voice about these types of issues and how successful he is. What's his impact on the culture? I don't know. I think I'm sure it's positive. How positive? That's, it's hard to measure these things because we don't know what it would look like if we didn't have voices like him. But I think what we're seeing is there are more and more voices coming around to recognize this. And if that continues, that can change the culture.
What I find interesting is part of the reason I think some of the things he says resonates is because, as you say, it connects with something inside us. Where, I can go and listen to some sort of guts. It's something straight out of the 1980s Wall Street type presentations, where sort of pumped up and greed is good, all those sorts of pieces. I can go and listen to that. But that leaves me sort of feeling aggressive and angry as opposed to fulfilled and spirit. Yeah, so I recognize the value in that thing. But of course, part of the reason he stands out is that there are lots of other people not saying that. And so I find it fascinating, and it comes back to that question about why is this not obvious? Because on a spiritual, simple level, I'd much rather listen to something uplifting and positive and nice and sort of, that's forward looking in a positive sense. And yet there are a lot more voices out there that are presenting the opposite. And clearly there must be an audience for those voices. So having said that Sinek and co are connecting on a positive, there are clearly audiences for these other voices. And there are people reading, you were talking about the media, if it bleeds, it leads. Well, there's a reason for that. So there's something fascinating about the human psyche that on the one hand is welcoming of these positive ethical messages. On the other hand, is also clearly welcoming of those exceptional opposite messages.
Well, it's really the force of gravity. The force of gravity pulls us down. And that exists psychologically, emotionally, metaphysically, intellectually. When I was in college, I studied literature. I loved to study Shakespeare. When was the last time I sat down and read Shakespeare? It's a tremendous discipline to engage in something like that. And frankly, when I get to the point of my day when I have time to sit down and read, I don't want to have to work that hard. So if I indulge my baser tendencies, right, to read something, to consume entertainment or news that is, scandalous or unrefined, let's say, as opposed to something that is uplifting, then I'm really allowing that cultural, that psychological gravity to pull me down. On the other hand, if I set a higher standard for myself, and it really doesn't take that much discipline. You said yourself, you like to be inspired. So, again, go back to the Roman Empire, right? The Roman aristocracy, the Roman nobility, they wanted to live their hedonistic lifestyle, have their orgies, right? But they needed to keep the citizens of Rome complacent. So they developed what they call the bread and circuses. Right? Today we would call it the welfare state and the entertainment industry. Right? Now, please, context, right? You need a welfare state because there are people who can't take care of themselves. And there has to be a safety net, and there has to be provision for people who are truly needy or need help pulling themselves back up. But when you widen that, when you make it easy for people not to be productive, you've got the force of gravity again. Right? Keep people happy, keep them distracted. What did they distract them with? Gladiatorial combat. Right? People hacking at each other with swords because that's exciting. That gets me all worked up. That gets my adrenaline pump. That makes me feel alive. Well, it's easier to have that make me feel alive than it is for me to make myself feel alive by doing something that's truly ennobling and truly uplifting. So these are the choices that we have to make as a society and we have to make as individuals. What are we going to consume? Are we going to allow ourselves to be distracted by the least refined impulses and images that we can find? Or are we going to seek out ideals that inspire us to hold ourselves accountable to a higher standard?
And that's really tough, right? This is sort of it. I mean, as you talk, I've got sort of, biblical themes of temptation running through my head, which is precisely the point. It's, it's this sort of that we're easily distracted away from these things, and the people doing the distracting know that. And so, and of course, nowadays it's optimized for distraction because this isn't a sort of, the capability to target us individually is increasing. So that's just, so that the sort of the access to these things, the propensity for it to be more tempting is just increasing as we go down particular routes. So this is going to become tougher rather than easier in some respects.
Oh, sure. I mean that's the world we live in, that world of instant gratification, immediate response. I mean, none of us have patience anymore. I mean, for myself, I know what it's like when my computer doesn't, the page doesn't come up instantaneously. I mean, I can lose patience so bad. It's embarrassing how juvenile I can respond when my computer's not behaving itself, which happens way too often. But, you talk about, biblical temptation. I mean, wouldn't it have been better if God would not have put that tree in the middle of the Garden of Eden? Don't put the tree there. Nothing to eat. That's bad. And we'd still be in paradise. But what's the point? The whole message of the story is that the human condition is one of temptation and dealing with temptation. And when you can eat from every tree in the garden except that one, what happens in your psychology? I have to have that one.
Right.
Nothing matters except that one. If I can't have that one, nothing else has any value to me. Of course, that's ludicrous. But that whole philosophy of the forbidden fruit, when things are wrong, when things are when we're told that things are wrong, when we're told you can't have something, you can't do that. Well, I saw a cartoon once. The guy's walking down the street, and there's a sign on the sidewalk that says "No unicycle riding allowed." And he says, "I suddenly have an overwhelming desire to ride a unicycle." I mean, once we recognize this in ourselves, then at least we are equipped to start to resist it.
And I mean, do you see all of these temptations, for want of a phrase, it's all part of the same thing? So if as you were talking, I was thinking, well, there's Amazon Prime is a good example, right? So I can have stuff delivered, same day if I'm in certain locations, next day if I'm really unknown, maybe it's 2 days if I'm super unlucky. So there's an example of something that on the face of it, that's good, isn't it? Because I can get hold of things really quickly and it's convenient and all those, and I don't have to waste my time going to shops. So I can paint a really positive picture. On the other hand, if I put it through the lens that you've just used, then that sense of sort of being able to have whatever I want, whenever I want it, and the impatience that, and you're right, I get, if they said it's coming today, and it comes tomorrow, that's appalling. That's like the worst possible outcome ever. Whereas actually, if they, of course, it's all perception, because if they said it was coming tomorrow and it came today, I'd be over elated. And so it's all to do with how you, but do you see all this as part of the same thing? That societally, all of this sort of sense of, I can have it now, ideally yesterday type thing, is that all bad? Is it all part of the same thing, or are there nuances there?
Oh, there's always nuance. I'm not a Luddite. I don't believe in tearing down the internet and forsaking all technology. I mean, technology is an extraordinary tool. Can you imagine where we would be today during COVID if we didn't have Zoom? I mean, how cut off from one another we really would be, and the way we've able in some cases to actually have stronger relationships, to widen our circle of acquaintances and even friends in ways that we never would have before this technology existed. Everything can be used for good or for bad. Let me take your example back a little bit further. I do construction projects from time to time, and I could drive to Home Depot, which is our big warehouse of do-it-yourself stuff. Or I could go to our little local hardware store. And if possible, I always try to go to the hardware store because I know I'm going to pay a few bucks more. But I like supporting local businesses. I like supporting small businesses. I like going in and seeing people that I know. I don't know their names, but I know them by sight, and they know me. I've been in there before, and I can ask them questions. They can help me. The experience of patronizing a local shop may cost me a little bit more in money, but I find that I gain more from it through the quality of the interaction and through the feeling that I'm actually contributing to community in a way I don't if I go to a warehouse store. Well, guess what? My little hardware store just sold out to a big warehouse place that's coming in.
Right.
So that was good in theory. But your question is it all bad? No. Convenience is good. A lot of the question really is, what do we do with the extra time? Right. What do I do now that I've got those extra minutes? I don't have to run out to the store because I can just push a button online. What do I do with that extra time? Am I using it for something of value, or am I frittering that away also?
Probably the latter.
Yeah.
Actually, I was thinking the irony is it frees me up to spend more time shopping.
Yes,
it's self-fulfilling in the same way that Netflix frees me up to watch more Netflix. So it's
well, you know what Netflix frees me up to do is spend time trying to figure out what I'm going to watch.
Right.
Because when I grew up in Los Angeles, we had, I think, 8 channels.
Wow, we had 3. So there you go.
Right? Now you've got just endless choices. And you can spend more time deciding what to watch than you actually spend watching. That's really twisted.
Right, but it's interesting because to bring us back to your ethical piece. I mean that range of choices. On the one hand, you sort of say this is all good stuff, and it's great because you can pick exactly what you want. On the other hand, we're bewildered and befuddled by choice. And in a world that you've outlined where your contention, and I agree with it, is that the ethics is important. If one wants to be truly ethical in what one does, you've got to start doing a little bit more investigation into some of these choices, because the choice that's presented to you is not, you need to sort of suss it out. So we can have we can choose a range where we buy our clothes, where our detergents, there's a whole range of things that we can acquire. But there's a lot more research, there's more effort required on our part, the bigger the choice. At least when we had limited supply, we had a sense of getting a handle on it. I find now that it's quite stressful, actually, if you think too hard about it and say, well, I want to change my provider of X. And I feel duty bound to do research into them in a way that I wouldn't, I haven't necessarily done for some of the people I've just kept going from the past.
Yeah, that goes back to your time investment, and sometimes we end up with differences without distinctions. I mean, one of my personal crisis moments in life is going to buy a toothbrush. There's this wall of toothbrushes. And they're all different, and I can actually be paralyzed.
Right? Yeah.
I don't want to spend too much. I want the right one, and I mean it's absurd to be investing. You've got all these different brands, There are a couple of TED Talks about this. And it was one of the points at which I lost some of my enamorment with Malcolm Gladwell when he's talking about how wonderful it is that we have 36 different varieties of ragu tomato sauce to choose from. Well, has anybody actually sampled all 36 and made a spreadsheet to determine which one they like the best? And does it really matter? There's enough of a difference between them. There's a point at which we just become so consumed with these choices that we're spending more time thinking about choices that aren't important than we are actually making those choices. There's a study done where they asked immigrants from Russia, I think. They gave them a bunch of different types of soda. And they didn't even understand what they were being offered, because what they had grown up with was basically there was one type of soda. So the choice is either soda or something else.
Right.
But their brains couldn't process different kinds of soda. Did they feel deprived because there weren't all these different brands and varieties? I don't think so. But the other problem here is that when we spend all this time making choices that really don't matter, then when we actually get to the important choices, we have decision fatigue. We've made so many irrelevant choices that when we get to the big choice, our brains shut down because there's just no mental energy left. I mean, why does Steve Jobs had one style of shirt, and one style of pants? Because he didn't want to spend time thinking about what he was going to wear. He wanted to save his brain for more important things.
I mean, I always find the US is bewildering, and we're not short of supply here. But if I go into, I don't know, CVS and I'm required to, orange juice, as you say, it's just this insane selection of with, without, this, that. And you kind of go, it's literally confusing as hell. But I do spend more time on that probably than on really important purchases like insurance, or because it's just, as you say, this is an overwhelming piece. And I think that's really interesting when you consider that some of the ethical questions that we have to ask, I mean, I'm talking about the big questions, those things do require time and effort to work out. And we do find ourselves in really sticky situations where, as you say, there's not necessarily a clear right answer. And I love this concept of gray. If you look at traditional things, it's all black and white, and the world's very simple because there's good and evil, and that's how movies are presented. So I love this idea that you picked up on, that it's actually a bit more complicated. And the bits we need help with are the bits that aren't sitting in those extremities, but where it's challenging and nuanced and difficult. And I think you're right, is if we've expended all our energy on the basics, then thinking about the more complex things where we genuinely should be spending our time becomes a lot harder.
Yeah. And that's why I talk about an ethical mindset, because in the same way, as we said before, if you want to be a good musician, practice. If you want to be a good athlete, practice. You want to be good at your trade. It's all the same thing. So if we want to be ethical, we have to engage in ethical thinking. This is why I wrote my book, which is an anthology of ethical dilemmas that pose a question that has two reasonable sides to it, and then a sort of guided discussion of how to work through it. Because there's not always going to be one right answer, and you're not going to get everybody to agree on what the right answer is. But having those conversations, even if they're with ourselves, even better with other people, in group conversation where there can be lots of different inputs, you could end up with the idea that, well, there's so many opinions that it doesn't really matter what you do. Well, that's not really the ideal. But to be able to say, well, let's try and look at it from every possible angle. Let's try to contemplate all the different aspects. And now when I actually find myself in the next ethical dilemma, I will have trained my mind to look at the situation in a way that's more objective, that's more even-handed, that's less focused on the immediate visceral or emotional or outcome that has most personal benefit to really being able to see it in a more comprehensive way that will get me closer to making better ethical decisions over the course of time.
To challenge that slightly, how do you know when you've made a good ethical decision?
Well, I heard a phrase once, a line once. It's not completely true, but and I don't remember where I heard this, that you don't have to talk yourself into doing the right thing. There's a certain moral compass that we all have. There's logic, which is useful. There's also that intuitive sense. Something doesn't feel right. If it doesn't feel right, then take some time to think it through. Does it mean you're going to make the right decision all the time? No. We're human beings. We're going to make mistakes. But that process of listening to your gut, listening to your conscience, and also asking other people. Sometimes we convince ourselves that a particular course of action is right, and then we try to justify it to someone else. Nothing comes out, because as soon as we try to articulate the idea, we say it wasn't even an idea. I never really formulated anything of logical substance. I just convinced myself that what I wanted to do was the right thing. So having people we can talk to, and of course it means picking the right people who are going to hold us accountable, who are going to be honest with us. A friend is not somebody who tells you what you want to hear. A friend is somebody who tells you what you need to hear. And those are the kinds of relationships. When we spend time with those kinds of people, if I'm with people of quality, I have to be a person of quality myself, or they're not going to want me in their company. If I want to hang out with people of lower standards, then that's going to exempt me from having to set higher standards for myself.
As you were talking, I was reflecting on the comment you made around we all make mistakes, which is undeniably true. And yet one of the things that I think is interesting in the sort of greater transparency nowadays is that there seems to be a less of a willingness to forgive. So people get absolutely eviscerated, particularly if they're already in the public eye, for very small things. And it's sort of that doesn't, we don't seem to be accepting of the fact that people can make mistakes, and there's a path back. And it seems to me that one of the ways that we resolve this issue is we have to start from that premise of we will all screw up at some point, and we'll do some things that are a bit silly, and ideally we'll make small mistakes that don't matter rather than big picture ones, and we'll learn from those big ones. But there seems to be a lack of forgiveness, which is people get absolutely eviscerated for doing things that actually sometimes I think they're but for the grace of God go I. And I'm fascinated what you think around the theme of forgiveness and whether that, is my perception right? There's less of that there. And if so, how do we deal with that?
We could do a whole hour on this. I mean, it's absolutely infuriating. The whole concept of repentance is fundamental to Jewish thinking. We just went through our high holidays, which are called the 10 days of repentance. And repentance requires you stop doing what was wrong, you feel bad about it, you confess it, and you make a plan to not repeat your mistakes. And if you go through that process, it doesn't mean you're going to be 100% successful. It means that you have done your due diligence. You have made a reasonable effort to set yourself back on a straight path. The Hebrew word for repentance is tshuva, which literally means return. It means I'm getting back on track. And some of these scandals that you were alluding to, I think it was a governor here in the States. They found a picture of him. I don't know whether it's from college. He was on a party in blackface. Okay, it's tasteless. It's crude, but it was 20 years ago. I've done stupid things more recently than 20 years ago. And I certainly did plenty of stupid things in college that I would not like broadcast. But I would like to think that I'm not going to make those mistakes anymore because I recognize them as mistakes. And I've grown up, and maturity doesn't happen. You're not born mature.
Right.
And it's a process. And when I was 25, I thought I was mature. Now I'm 60. Things should look a little different. And if they don't, that's a problem. But this idea that you're held accountable forever for any mistake you made, that is poisonous. Because what it really is saying is, don't bother trying to be better. Because you will never be accepted. You will always be held accountable to the worst mistake you ever made with no possibility of repairing or correcting what you did wrong. And if we take that approach as a society, we're finished.
Right. And I always sort of talk about the death penalty, this concept. If you sort of say, well, there's a death penalty for killing one person. Well, then hell, if I'm in that position, I might as well kill 50 because I've already crossed that line. I think there's lots of sort of views of that thing. So, well, once you've done that, there's no route back. And I think there's a lot of causes of problems in organizations with people not coming forward is if you don't give them a path to be able to come back, then you find yourself on the wrong side of that line. And once you're there, if there's no way of coming back, you might as well keep going on that side because you're suffering the consequences of being on the wrong side of this proverbial line. So I think that's a fascinating point.
Oh, sure. And I mean, certainly if you're working as a member of a business community and you discover that you made a mistake, what are you going to want to do? Cover it over so it goes undetected, or fix it? And if you can't fix it yourself, ask for help fixing it. But if there isn't a culture of trust that I can go and I can say, listen, I made a mistake, or I'm not sure how to handle this, or I could use some help doing this, to ask for help, to ask for correction, ask for guidance. I mean, if people can't come forward, then what motivation do they have to actually improve in their work? And how is that going to affect the bottom line? Right? We're coming back full circle. What's the benefit? The practical benefit of ethics is you end up with a more effective, more engaged, more collaborative workforce. And a mistake today is only going to get worse tomorrow if it goes uncorrected.
I think that is a lovely note on which to finish. But before we do, can you let my listeners know how they can find you and when is this book coming out?
The book is out already in digital form. It is due out any time, any moment in print, and you can find it and my articles, videos, my TED Talk on my website, which is my name, YonasonGoldson.com, YONASONGOLDSON.com. And I'm always happy to engage listeners and take the conversation forward.
Fabulous. Well, listen, thank you. It's been a fascinating conversation. As you say, there's plenty of topics that we could have explored in more detail, but it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me. I will put links to all of those things in the show notes, but thank you very much for your time.
You are very welcome. It's been my pleasure as well.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My huge thanks to Yonasan for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Yonasan and his book, please see the show notes. There are links to all of those right there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, you can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the platforms. If you like the show and have a chance to leave a review, 5-star ratings really help other people to find the show and me to continue to attract the kind of high-quality guests I've managed thus far. I'll be back with another episode of this podcast very soon, but in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.